Good morning, everybody. We are back to our hotel room, and people are hopefully following us online once again. This is the second half a day of a conference on the European elections and more broadly on the topic what liberals and democrats can do, how can they fight with. Certainly we have in mind a populist challenge in Hungary especially, but also in the region and more broadly globally. After yesterday's half-a-day event, we will focus today on the Visegrad countries and more broadly on the global situation. The title of this session is From the Central European Stage to the International Political Arena, the Future of the Liberal World Order. So we have a very ambitious agenda, and we will have hopefully time enough to discuss all the topics we have planned. So without any further delay, I would just introduce very shortly our presenters one by one. The first speaker is Zora Jaurová, who is coming from Bratislava. She's a member of the Slovak parliament representing progressive Slovakia or Slovakia. How do you say it in Slovak?
Progresívne Slovensko.
Exactly, that's what I wanted to say. And certainly her presence is very important for us because today is a decisive moment, the second round of the presidential election in Slovakia. So maybe by the end of your presentation, we will know the result, or maybe just a little, not yet, a little bit later, but maybe you can tell us who is going to win. But more seriously, and okay, the title of her presentation is Navigating Slovakia's Political Trajectory, an Orbán-Inspired Route. So that's the first presentation. Then we will have Jacek Kucharczyk from Warsaw. He is the president of the executive board of the Institute of Public Affairs and actually an old friend of the Hungarian Europe Society. And the title of his presentation is Lessons for Europe from the Polish Anti-populist Turn. So we will have at least one positive statement, hopefully, during the day. Then we will have Roland Freudenstein, another old friend of the Hungarian Europe Society, who is now the founder of a Brussels-based Freedom Hub, or better to say a Washington-based Freedom Hub, which has
That's
an
the
office.
other function.
Oh,
That's
it's too complicated for me. You can explain it later. Good. So, but you are coming from Brussels, and that's the Free Russia Foundation, which has an office.
They have the central office in Washington.
Very good. So the title of your presentation is Are the Bad Guys Winning? The Challenge of Autocracy and the Global Solidarity of Democrats. Hopefully another positive statement you will have at the end. And then we will have Zsuzsanna Végh, who is a member of our Hungarian Europe Society, but at the moment she is the program officer at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and coming from Berlin. And your presentation is about an illiberal international on the horizon, an illiberal international, sort of populist international. Is it coming or not? I don't know whether it will be positive or negative at the end. So we have time enough for all these presentations. And Zora, you are the first. You have, all of you have 15 minutes more or less. Please go ahead.
Good morning. Well, since I am probably the only politician in the room, it's a very strange situation for me to be in the room full of academics, because so far I've been on the other side of the crowd. But I have prepared this very non-academic content, so I hope that it will be supplemented by my colleagues later, because I was asked just to provide an insight into a present Slovak political situation, which can be in many cases significant for the topic of this morning. When István asked me for this presentation, he suggested the title illiberal partnership between two Visegrad countries. And it's very interesting that for me, that it's already perceived from the Hungarian side as two illiberal countries. I understand why. I understand it very well, because you see the same signs and symptoms you've been facing in your own country. However, I will try to show you, maybe on a few examples, why I think that even though maybe the historical and cultural ties between Hungary and Slovakia are very strong, and we are in many aspects very similar, I still think that the situation in Slovakia is not fully following the Hungarian path. However, it can turn very quickly towards that direction. Because obviously, the fourth government of Robert Fico, who is the prime minister for the fourth time now, is clearly now following the Orbán's playbook. But as I will show you, he's not that successful yet. I was actually also inspired by an article written by two political researchers, Lenka Bustíková and Petra Guasti, in 2017 for Politics and Governance. And the title of the article is Illiberal Turns and Swerves in Central Europe. And basically, they analyze the political development in V4 countries in that article, and their conclusions are that even if it often seems that all four countries are one way or another turning to illiberal paths, it is mostly only swerving or divergences in most of the cases. It's not the complete turn from the democracy, and they are analyzing it on several aspects and several areas. And the conclusion is that while in Slovakia, Czech Republic, and Poland, all these divergences are more some kind of oscillation around the idea of democracy, or pendulum swinging around what we understood as the liberal democracy. Obviously, in Hungary, it's the only country which can be qualified as the one which turned away. But this was valid in 2017, based on what they wrote. So maybe we can ask ourselves if it's still valid also in 2024, and how did it change over these few years. And when you look to the recent development in all four countries, or the three other countries, then in comparison to Hungary, it is clear that Orbán's way is very inspiring for these countries, from many different reasons. We could have seen that in Poland, even though the Polish way, and maybe Jacek will explain it better, was slightly different than Hungarian way. But we could also partially see it from time to time also in Czech Republic, and we can only guess what can happen after the next parliamentary elections in Czech Republic. After the last elections we had in Slovakia in September last year, Slovakia follows rapidly the Orbán scenario. Maybe just for those who don't follow the Slovak situation that closely, after the elections at the end of September 23, Robert Fico, who was already 3 times prime minister before, has formed his fourth government with a party which split from his party. It's party called Hlas, and it was actually part of his party Smer before, but there is one leader who split from Robert Fico and who wanted to show the more European, more humanistic, more progressive face of his party. However, immediately after the elections, they formed a coalition together, and the third fellow in the party is very famous Slovak nationalistic party, which is, I will come back to it because it's very significant for Slovak-Hungarian relationships, is a typical nationalistic party which played a big role in the steering the anti-Hungarian sentiment in 90s, and now they transformed into this crypto-fascistic, anti-European crowd. However, what is very funny, Orbán is the biggest example for them. So it's not anymore anti-Hungarian sentiment. Orbán and Hungary is the best ally for them, which is very interesting, and that would be a content for the whole conference, actually, how the Slovak-Hungarian sentiments has changed over those decades. And immediately after the government was formed, they started to create legislative and operational steps which follows the Orbán's example. They started with the reform of the criminal law, which was like outrageous, because basically its only purpose was to save their friends and allies, including the Prime Minister Fico, who was also investigated for corruption and for other things. The only reason for this criminal law reform was to save those allies and their friends from being criminally persecuted. And they wanted to adopt it in this it's called by constitution the speed procedure. So they go around the classical legislational process, and the constitution only allows it in very specific cases, when there is natural catastrophe, or there is a big threat to economy, or there is an imminent threat to human rights of certain groups. In that case, this short legislative procedure, the speed procedure, can be used. However, none of these reasons applied for this case, but they still wanted to adopt it quickly and start with that. They didn't succeed, because we as an opposition, we managed to prolong the debate in the parliament for months. And because this debate in the actually I was sleeping for many nights in the parliament, because they were trying to make us tired, so they did this all night meetings and stuff like that. So the meeting of the parliament, which started in November, took until January. Normally it's for 2 weeks. And they, at the end, after months of this filibuster, when they actually adopted the law, because they have the majority, it was stopped by the Constitutional Court from many reasons, and the Constitutional Court issued this preliminary limitation, so the law is not valid yet, and we will see what happens with it. But of course, there are other laws. They proposed the law, they want to abolish the state TV, and it's the public TV, they want to change it into the state TV, fully controlled by the state. The Prime Minister is on regular basis threatening to the judges of the courts, saying, if I was you, I would resign immediately, because then something much worse can happen to you. And this kind of rhetoric is being applied. And of course, they also are trying to limit the operation of civil society and the NGOs. The next meeting of the parliament starts next week, and there is already a proposal for the law which was modeled by the Orbán's law on NGOs and this foreign agent law. The patterns are there, everything. However, so far they did not succeed to do anything the way they wanted it to do. Because we have this Slovak saying, maybe it's the same in Hungarian, a proverb saying that if two people do the same, it mustn't be the same. And I see many differences, but maybe I mentioned just the three areas where I think Fico is not Orbán, and the situation in Slovakia is still slightly different than it is in Hungary. So when I'm saying Fico is not Orbán, I mean by that he is less talented than Orbán, politically speaking. Also, it shows very much in their approach to the institutions. And this is something I would like to stress here when we talk about the populism, when we talk about how to win this debate with the populism and with illiberal tendencies. I think we have to talk more about the institutional base of the democracy, because that's probably the only thing which can save us from the illiberal dictators. And you can see it on the fact that if somebody like Orbán or many others decides to go the illiberal way, the first thing they do is they destroy the institution protecting democracy and individual rights of people, and basically the pluralistic society. And it's very important to mention this, because I think this is the very specific for Central Europe, for this post-communist territory. And Slovakia is the best example of that, because Slovakia, as you know, exists as a separate country only for 30 years. And that means that while Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, throughout the history, that despite of the communism, they had the chance to build the backbone of the state in the institutional structure. In Slovakia, I think this is the biggest problem, and we've been facing it in all our post-89 history, because and that's actually why Fico won the last elections, because the government before Fico, which was the government which should be the change from previous Fico's government, and people voted for the change because they didn't want Fico anymore. Unfortunately, they voted for a lunatic, this like totally anti-system lunatic who became prime minister, and basically not because he wanted to be an illiberal dictator, but because he is a lunatic, he was destroying the institutions, even the remains of the institutional base we had. And basically what happened in Slovakia was that in combination with COVID and all other catastrophes of last 4 or 5 years, the chaos the previous government created in the country was so bad and so unbearable. I know that there have been like hundreds of people who were getting like heart attacks watching Prime Minister press conferences, which was a torture. It was really a torture. When I was watching his press conferences, I was scared to the depth of my soul that this guy is deciding upon the country I live in. And after this experience, the Slovak voters said, this chaos is worse than corruption, is worse than the illiberal government, because it's unbearable, and that's very important to understand. And this is something we have to think about when we think about how to deal with the illiberal tendencies, because I think it's only the democratic institutions and only the well-built backbone of the state, democratic state, which can save us from these ideas of being illiberal. And that's, I think, but you might correct me, but from how I am observing Orbán, I think what he did really well is that he destroyed the democratic institution, but he built his own illiberal, different type of institutions, and that's why he is so strong. Fico is not able to do that. It's clear from his 3 previous governments that he is not able to do this kind of institutional base for his new order, whatever it is. And the other thing, I think where there is a difference is that my understanding of why people like Orbán could be successful is that sometimes their illiberal way of governing the country shows as more efficient than to bother with democracy and with all the deliberations, with including the society. The processes take longer. And I think he probably managed to show that his way is seemingly more efficient than the democratic way, which is not true, of course, but it can seem to many people like that. It's again, this is not the case of Fico. His 3 previous governments have been happening during the time of economic conjuncture, when the country was doing really well. He was just spending the money. And the main reason why people were not happy with Fico was that the country was not developing. Now it's the first time when he governs the country in the bad times. And so far, the way he does it, it doesn't seem that he can prove that this way of governing the country is more efficient than the democratic way. The second thing where I see some differences is that maybe the enemies they try to show are the same, but the ideology is different. And it's, of course, the enemies, the populists need enemies. They need somebody people will be afraid of. And these enemies are usually always the same. When we compare Slovakia and Hungary, okay, in 90s, our enemies were Hungarians. This is not an issue anymore after Orbán took the power. But we have common enemies, Fico and Orbán. It's migrants, it's LGBT community, now it's Ukrainians, Romas. There is one specificity of Slovakia. In our case, it's also bears. You are laughing, but that's a real political issue. It's already in second elections, bears saved my LGBTI friends from being the worst, because bears are the worst now. basically, we have a lot of bears in the woods, and from time to time it happens that they go to the villages and they can endanger people. But because the Minister of Environment is a hunter who wants to kill all the animals and who wants to turn the national parks in Luna parks, in thematic parks. So they actually, we are talking, now we have the presidential campaign. One of the main topic is the bears, and wait for it, next week, the parliament meets in an extraordinary session where the government wants to adopt a constitutional law. They want to put the right to shoot bears in the constitution. So the enemies are almost the same. Of course, because you always need like somebody who is different, the other is dangerous and suspicious, because that is basically creating a pool of resistance when the society is diverse, and so on. That's the guidebook of any populist, yeah. But I think Fico lacks the big idea which is behind all the Orbán operation, and that's this idea of lost glory, of big Hungary, of, you know, something which was make Hungary great again. In Slovakia, we've been never great. So it's very hard to say make Slovakia great again because there was no great time, which is very good in this case, because that basically doesn't allow you to use this kind of fake ideological story, even though they are trying to create one. And the third, and I will end with that, and I think that's the most important difference, and the most important difference is that Fico is weak. He has only 4 votes majority in the parliament, which is really funny when we vote on anything, because if they have 2 MPs who got some disease, they don't have the majority. So I've seen it many times, and these are the funny story from the parliament, but I've seen it many times that once the voting is coming, I see the MP members from the government running from some places because I think they have like threats under them. Because if a few of them don't show, then they are in real trouble and they cannot approve their laws. And also, and that's the last thing, one is this very weak majority in the parliament, and the other one is strong civil society, which is opposing the government. And maybe this might sound a bit strange to say it on Hungarian soil, but my dear friends, we Slovaks, we were the first on the illiberal path. We already did it in the 90s with Mečiar, and it was horrible. But we also have the experience that it can be combated. And we did it combat in 98. And it was done with the strong help of the civil society. And this experience, this collective experience, is somewhere there in the country. So we had, like, throughout the last months, we had every week big demonstration on the street. People would demonstrate not only against the criminal law, but now they demonstrate to protect the state TV, which is very strange because state TV is not something which would be really so sexy for people to go to the streets, but they do. And I meet like regular people in the shops. They come to me because they know it's my topic. I am very much into the topics of cultural policies. So old lady comes to me in the supermarket and she says, fight for that TV, fight for it. We really need it. So the civil society is crucial and is important. And I don't have more time, but maybe then in the debate, we can also talk about what are the conclusions for the future and what can be done together in order to fight with that. Thank you.
Definitely, we will continue, and I would love to ask a lot of questions, but following our agenda, we have to shift to the next speaker. Just one exemption. I loved your new category, lunatic populism. Maybe that's the term we were looking for at the beginning.
That's the Slovak addition to world politics.
Okay.
Maybe also US.
Actually, your presentation was not so pessimistic as I was debating because of how you made the comparison. But let's go back to you later on. Now it's Jacek who is going to speak about the Polish experience.
Indeed, I would ask you maybe to show my presentation because I'm going to focus very closely on the Polish elections on October the 15th last year and try to show you. So what happened actually, why we had the change, despite skepticism of many people, including myself, that a political change through elections is still possible or was still possible. We were proven not so much wrong because I sort of suspended my judgment. I will show you why I thought that it would be extremely difficult for the opposition to win the elections. I'm not sure because the title in the program, I changed it a bit, but I still don't think that there is a silver bullet in this experience. I mean, there is no one thing that you can point to and say, this is the way to overcome populism. It's a way more complicated story. Can I?
Yep, press.
Okay,
There you go.
so these are the elements of these complications, and I hope I will have time to get to the last 2 points because I think they were.
You can look at this.
Sure, they were crucial for the outcome, but some other elements were also quite important. I wanted to start by showing you 2 graphs illustrating the public mood in the country just in the run-up to the elections. This is the first one. Please don't get intimidated. What it really shows is that for most of the post-transition political history in Poland, Polish public was quite unhappy, and we are probably, as other Eastern Europeans, grumpy people. And that unhappiness provided ample grounds for populism in Polish politics. Now, the paradox is that, first of all, in 2015, when Law and Justice won the elections for the first time, I mean, it was historically the second time because they were in power between 2005 and 2007, the public mood was improving, the economic situation was improving. They still won, and they took advantage of it. So this period that you can see here between 2017 and 2020 is quite unusual because of the prevailing good mood, and it also explains why the opposition was not able to win the elections in 2019, because I mean, all other things set aside, the public mood was in favor of the populist government, and they despite the anti-democratic changes that they already started introducing, it was extremely difficult for the opposition to win. And now you have a simpler diagram, only looking at the ratings of the Morawiecki's government, which was most of the time, PiS only had 2 prime ministers, Morawiecki was the second one, and most of the time of PiS was under his power. And if you look at this moment when the red and green lines cross, the red line shows negative ratings of the government, and in the previous one it showed negative public mood, the green light positive. in fact, both graphs cross in the same moment, which was historically significant. And this is end of October 2020. And what happened in the end of October 2020 was that the constitutional government, which was by that time controlled by Law and Justice government, the Constitutional Tribunal, issued an order, a ruling that basically further restricted the abortion law in Poland. And it was followed by enormous protests for several days on the streets of Warsaw and other cities. And the government reacted with very strong police presence, riot police, which attacked the mainly women protesters. And so the protests were put down. But interestingly enough, this change in public mood lasted, remained. So in a way, we had a feeling that the protests, despite their size, didn't amount to anything. But now when you look back, it was the beginning of the end of this government, actually. That's I think, that what you can conclude from these graphs. So the public mood suddenly turned against the government and against the ruling party. But that was not, there was not a single reason behind it, even though it's nice that you can actually pinpoint the exact moment when the change happened. So if you want to list the reasons for this public discontent, you have to name several reasons, and they combine, in fact, economy and government politics and democracy and reproductive rights. So there was an accumulation of reasons why people stopped liking the government. And paradoxically, it didn't so much translate it into the ratings of the ruling party, because they remained the leading political force until the very moment of elections, when they were not leading anymore. But all these reasons were out there, and the fact was that they made it created the grounds for the oppositional victory. But I would say this was a necessary condition, perhaps, for the political change, but not sufficient. We needed the opposition to actually do the job that they were expected to do, because it was not enough for people to be unhappy with the situation. They needed to believe that situation can be changed through the voting. And when we approached the elections, and that was the reasons why many observers were quite skeptical whether the opposition can still win the elections, because after 8 years of Law and Justice government, the playing field, the political playing field, was completely, let's say, tilted or uneven, tilted in favor of the government and the ruling party. There were a number of reasons, and we did a lot of analytical work on why there is a problem, and why the opposition really, as I put it in one of the media interviews, that the opposition had to fight the elections with one hand tied behind its back, basically. And there was not a single reason, but I would point out to, for example, the surveillance that key politicians and activists were under, and that was used already in 2019. The leader of the opposition was, his telephone was infected with Pegasus. So basically, Law and Justice knew what the opposition was going to do, sometimes before the opposition knew it themselves. But there were these other things, like the electoral system, which is twisted, and the electoral districts give advantage on the electoral districts, basically, where Law and Justice was strong, produce more mandates that they should, according to population division. So you have all these reasons. I'm not going to read them now, but you see that despite the fact that the public mood was on the side of the opposition, the playing field was against it. So the question was what the opposition and civil society will do in this situation. As it turned out, what helped the oppositions were the dominant campaign narratives, because according to, I mean, this was elections run in a highly polarized political situation, and both sides, both the government and the key oppositional parties, said that these are very high stakes elections. And the government used this narrative that opposition, especially Donald Tusk and the Civic Platform, are traitors who will sell out Poland and that Poland will lose independence. And they were really raising the emotions, trying to mobilize their own electorate, whereas the opposition basically was saying that this is the last chance to reverse Poland from the road towards autocracy, to regain democracy, and to regain the civic rights that were lost during Law and Justice government. So the fact that these elections had the highest turnout in the history of Polish elections was largely because of these two narratives that mobilized people to vote. Now, what were the key strategies, as I see them, of the opposition strategies, the key elements? Well, first of all, the opposition managed to understand the reasons of public discontent and speak the language, try to speak the same language as people on the street were speaking. They understood that, for example, this crisis of cost of living was very important, at least as important as the crisis of democracy. So a lot of talk was actually about the economic situation and Law and Justice mismanagement of the economy, and that really hit them hard, because part of the reasons for the high support before was that they presented themselves as the party that gets things done. That was, so even people who ideologically didn't support Law and Justice Party would admire their efficiency in which they were ruling Poland. And the opposition questioned that. They said that they are incompetent, corrupt, and they basically think about themselves and their enrichment, and they pointed to a number of corruption scandals that were made, that the public was aware of. The opposition spoke about the threats to democracy. As I said, this was the dominant narrative, but they were aware that people expect that new government will present itself as people who will know what to do once they win power. So it was not enough to criticize. They had to show that they have a positive program. And what else? They also, in a way, tried to unbid the Law and Justice Party in their sort of economic populism, let's say. So Law and Justice was famous for the handouts to different social groups, and at some point when Tusk was questioned about it, he said, what they pay, we will also pay. So basically, it was not so much about the competition, but they said that don't worry, your benefits will be safe with us. And that was basically, in this way, they leveled up one of the key narratives of Law and Justice Party. And they did the same, these are the two other points, Law and Justice discourse on migration and security, which was one of the dominant narratives that gave them Law and Justice legitimation. And on migration, Tusk started to use the language of security. So he said that for us, the primary thing is the security of our borders. And basically, he disarmed, that many of the civil rights organizations didn't like this, but he disarmed the Law and Justice whole narrative, how civil platform will lead to opening up the borders and millions of migrants coming in. And the same on security. They basically questioned the competence of managing the military by Law and Justice Party, and the fact that a week before the election, some top generals from the army handed in their resignation saying that Law and Justice is incompetent and making a mess of the army, did really help to, change the narrative. And they also didn't fall into this patriotism versus cosmopolitanism trap. And the big demonstrations that Tusk organized were also, full of red and white flags and colors and European flags. But they didn't allow the populists to have a claim that they solely represent patriotic Poland. Now for the civil society, what role they played, I mentioned again a couple of points, and the protests which were happening in Poland for 8 years, but they became much more intense during the second term of office of Law and Justice Party. And they actually, as I will demonstrate, help to mobilize certain groups of people. I think that the interesting debate within the civil society and within the political parties was whether the opposition should face Law and Justice presenting one electoral list as one big coalition from left to right, or go separately. And many of my colleagues in civil society actually put a lot of effort into convincing the opposition politicians that they should go together and present one electoral list. It didn't happen, and as you know, that there were 3 coalitions challenging Law and Justice, and each of these groupings was actually a coalition of smaller parties. So it was still a coalition-based effort, but not a single coalition. But what we did, meaning my institute and a group of other NGOs, instead of encouraging politicians to create this one big platform, we encouraged the opposition to engaged in programmatic talk, and we held like 17 debates on different issues with key opposition members from these different groupings. And at the end, we produced a report with recommendations for the program of united opposition after the elections. So this was, the aim was to show that even though the opposition is diverse, that they can create their own government and that they can create their own platform. This is the picture with 4 leaders of the key oppositional groupings holding the report in May 2023, so 5 months before the elections. They came out. It happened with the backing of Polityka Weekly, which is one of the main, I think the main independent magazine in Poland. So there was a sort of unity in diversity within the opposition, and that was the image that was projected. All these figures basically very clearly stated that they will not enter a coalition with Law and Justice Party or with Konfederacja, which is this other right-wing grouping. So now, very quickly, the election results. As you see, and this is because I think that this, what I said about the advantages that Law and Justice had, Law and Justice still came as the winner in the sense of the biggest share of votes went to Law and Justice Party, but they fell short of having a majority of seats, and this is how it translated. The opposition had a very comfortable majority, comfortable enough for Law and Justice to be unable to create an alternative coalition, even though they tried to bribe this group, which is described here as Trzecia Droga, which means the third way. And because they positioned themselves as different than the key opposition, the Tusk party, Law and Justice thought that they can pull them over, but it didn't happen. They made it very clear from the beginning that they are not interested in being a partner for peace, despite their being more conservative than a civic coalition. So basically, because of the size, the comfortable majority of the opposition, all the tricks, and we were really worried whether peace will give up power. In the Senate, when there were single constituencies, I think that's also interesting in Hungarian context, the opposition had a united list, and the result was quite remarkable because the opposition won 66 out of 100 seats in the Senate. So that never happened in the previous history. Okay, very briefly, two things. Demography, young versus old, and women. Sorry. As you see, we have a structural problem in Poland. If you look closely, this compares the number of people, of young people versus older senior citizens as this 23, the number of people over 60 was almost 10 million, whereas the number of people younger than 29 were only less than 4 millions. And Law and Justice, basically, their grip on power largely dependent on keeping these older voters loyal. So what was crucial in this election, I mean, that was the fact that the opposition had to mobilize other groups especially and demobilize these older voters if they wanted to win the elections. And as you see on this slide, this is the difference in electoral turnout between the elections in 2019 and 2023. And you see how remarkable is the increase in turnout among the youngest voters. And in fact, that was one of the reasons. I mean, in all other categories, there is also an increase in turnout, especially between 50 and 59 years old, whereas the older people did not mobilize to the same extent for different reasons. And I think this crisis of cost of living was one reason why they, even though they were in a way pampered because Law and Justice produced all the programs to help them out, they were not as loyal to the party as other groups were angry with the party. So the voting pattern, as you see, the older people are, the more likely they were to vote for Law and Justice, whereas young people, only 15% of them voted for Law and Justice parties. So that's I think also shows you why age and demography matters so much in Polish politics, and why the aging of the society is really a challenge to democracy under present circumstances, even though the opposition managed to overcome it. What is not so good is the high support for far-right Confederacja in this youngest cohort, and this is mainly because of young men, not young women. So I will. This is just the very last two slides about women in these elections. What was extraordinary in the elections was that all main political parties decided that they have to speak to women separately, women as voters separately. This graph illustrates the number of women on electoral lists, and there was a record high, 43%, almost 44% of all candidates in the elections were women. And it was especially high among the two main opposition parties. The left and also Civic Coalition put a lot of women on the lists, and it turned out it translated itself also into a number of women in the parliament. So we had elections which were record high in terms of women candidates. And the participation of women in the parliament for the first time reached 30%, which is also historically the highest number of women MPs that we will have. But maybe more importantly for the result, the mobilization of women as voters was also an important part of the final result. And as you see, the difference between women voting and men voting in these elections is not so big. But the starting point is that in 2019, there was the same percentage of women and men voting. In these elections, for the first time, there were more women voters than men voters. And this illustrates why this was important. Women voted differently. The biggest difference is the vote for far-right Confederacja, when it was mainly men who voted for this party. But women tended to vote for the opposition, and even though the particular differences are not that big, there was a simulation of how the Polish parliament would look if only women voted, and how it would look if only men voted. And it turned out that if only women voted, the opposition would have almost constitutional majority. If only men voted, we would have a government consisting of Law and Justice and Confederacja. We would have a right-wing government. So these small differences actually made a big difference altogether. Yes, so women and young people were quite crucial. And this is my final word. And what are the lessons for Europe? I think we may discuss now. Thank you so much for your attention.
Sure, thank you, Jacek. Wonderful. Without any further comment, the floor is yours, Roland.
Yep, thank you. Thank you so much, István, and thanks for having me. Yeah, before I look at the global aspects of all this, let me just establish my Central European credentials here. I may come from Brussels, but my grandparents on the mother's side were Austrians to the bone. My mother was born in a place named Novi Jičín. I worked for a Slovak organization for 2.5 years. I've lived in Poland for 7 years and speak the language. My wife is from Slovenia. My family name sounds ultra-Jewish. What could be more Central European than that? And I can say Hódmező vásárhely faster than some people can say Budapest. So I think that is important to stress. Yeah, I mean, we've heard fascinating presentations already, and I'd love to delve into a discussion on this already. But let me just stick to my 15 minutes. And ask the question, so are the bad guys winning? The challenge of global authority and the global solidarity, the challenge of autocracy and the global solidarity of democrats. And I'm deliberately quoting Anne Applebaum, who wrote a fantastic op-ed in late 2021. So quite almost literally on the eve of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, with the provocative title, "The Bad Guys Are Winning." She essentially says that while the second half of the 20th century was a good time for liberal democracy, the 21st century, globally speaking, has actually been a good time for autocrats so far. And let's spend a few minutes on what exactly this backsliding consists of. So that's point number one. Let's ask how autocracy incorporated, as she calls it, actually works. And then third, of course, obviously, let's talk about counter strategies. And as I said in the title, the key is the global solidarity of democrats. Not democracies, that's also important, but democrats, because these are real people, right? This is us. Okay, so the global backslide, just one figure by Freedom House, a well-known institution in our circles. We are now in the 18th year of democratic backsliding. So for the past 18 years, the number of countries that are called that are labeled unfree or only partly free, Hungary falls into that category, have increased consistently for 18 years. So 2006 basically was the last year, 2005-06 were the last years when democracy was still considered growing. The spectacular examples of, at least for the time being, successful autocracies, of course, are the two global leaders of the pack, and that's Russia and China. But behind them, there's a whole number of small and very diverse, actually, countries, from Cuba to Venezuela to Belarus to Iran to North Korea. And then, of course, followed by a whole bunch of lesser, less clearly dictatorial countries and hybrid systems mostly in the so-called global south. And then, of course, also the movements and organizations and parties that we are mostly discussing here inside Western democracies. So I think what we're seeing today is this, well, we can all admit to the hubris of 1989 when we believed that there was a global march of liberal democracy, the end of history. You remember this famous formula of Francis Fukuyama, and basically the victory, the lasting victory of free market, checks and balances, free and fair elections, and all the paraphernalia of liberal democracy. But as one of the most famous Slovenes, Slavoj Žižek, the other one is Melania Trump. So as Slavoj Žižek, the philosopher, said in an interview with the BBC, which is worth watching, 9/11 was kind of the end of the dream of global democracy, or of this uninterrupted march forward of global democracy. And 2008, with the financial and economic crisis, the end of the belief in the global capitalism expanding forever. But, so, end of the first point. Before we fall into complete despair, let's look at some of the characteristics of these new autocracies in order to then develop counter strategies. So Autocracy Incorporated, as Anne Applebaum calls them. From Xi Jinping to Putin via so many others, the leading autocrats of the world have learned from the mistakes of their predecessors in a way. And these were, of course, the dictators of the communist countries in the 20th century. So particularly Central and Eastern Europe communists. But they've also learned from the temporary defeat of autocracy in the first years of the 21st century. And these were the color revolutions, you know, from Georgia to Kyrgyzstan, to other, Ukraine, of course, most prominently several times, to the Arab Spring revolutions of 2011, 2012. Let's first ask, what's the ideological composition of these autocracies here? They certainly have a common interest, which is regime survival. But Anne Applebaum argues quite consistently that there is no such thing as a common ideology that could be said to have defined 20th century communism, right? Based on Marxist-Leninist doctrine, with different national shades and so on, but it was one encompassing ideology. Today, if you ask about ideology for the autocracies, you can go from communism, but a very special kind in China, to sovereignist nationalism in the case of Russia, to Islamist dictatorship in the case of Iran. But they do have in common this regime survival instinct, and they do have in common a certain, I would say, elements or ideological means that mainly refer to the enemies, their perceived threats and enemies. So they're all fighting democratic forces inside their own countries. And of course, they all want to more or less revise the global liberal order. They are revisionist. It's a nice term that has gone through many mutations over history, but today it refers precisely to Russia and China and other countries that define the current world order as Western-based, Western-made, and therefore bad for the majority of the countries of the world. So the second sub-point here is, and this is the base for this label, Autocracy Incorporated, is they all support each other in unprecedented ways. There is a financial and trade and economic aspect with, governments trading with each other, state-owned enterprises actually trading with each other, bailing each other out. There are military aspects, and this not always goes from north to south, but can go in reverse, like we've seen with the Iranian drones exported to Russia and now destroying Ukrainian cities. It can be technological. Look at Chinese facial recognition software exported to many, many regimes across the world. I think Serbia is one of them that uses it very, very efficiently. It can also be methodological. Look at the way Russia has developed social media activities, trolling, spreading narratives and disinformation. China, until about 2019, had nothing of the sort. And in a very short space of time, especially during the pandemic, quickly took a page from the Russian playbook and started developing trolls in social media. And of course, it can be political. Look at the way the United Nations systems works in terms of posts being grabbed by autocracies, or look at votes in the General Assembly and other places. I could spend some time on the global south, but let's leave that for later on. Now, one other element of this autocracy incorporated are what I would call the meta-narratives of these countries, these dictatorships. First of all, of course, there is an element of turning liberalism against itself by talking about wokeness, cancel culture, and how liberalism has become illiberal. Orbán is a master at doing this. And you will see later on that I think that actually, as much as we may despise him, he's got a point on that one. So there is some room for improvement of liberals, actually. But there are deeper narratives, and I will just give you two of them that unite all the autocrats. One is the past versus future divide. For us, figures like Trump and Orbán or Putin may look like people that seem to come from the 19th century, right? Well, I tell you what, for him, we are hippies from the 1970s. We represent a kind of aberration of history, a temporary phase, and now, finally, in the 21st century, things get back to normal. The actually nations and István Hegedűs yesterday said that very well. The belief that only strong nations based on family values and religion can actually survive in the 21st century. And this whole stuff about LGBTQ rights and also limiting national sovereignty in European integration or something, this is all Soros-infested nonsense, which will actually destroy our societies. So this narrative, we are the future, not you guys. And there is another one, which is related to this, and here I quote Tim Snyder, the historian from the US. Tim Snyder juxtaposes two late 20th century, early 21st century ways of thinking, and he calls them the politics of inevitability and the politics of eternity. Actually, he takes distance from both. He actually says that one produced the other. The first produced the second. The politics of inevitability has both elements of the classical left, you know, humankind progresses to a better stage. There's an automatism in history. But it also has a great deal of neoliberalism, the Washington consensus. The market will solve things. Democracy will invariably spread across the world. And he says this actually unhinges, it becomes unhinged if it's not enriched and actually limited at certain points, because there is no automatism. It takes, I mean, quoting Ronald Reagan, you know, tyranny is always only just one generation away. There has to be the political will and the political action of Democrats to keep it that way. And if it goes wrong, it leads to the politics of eternity, which is, hey, come on, wake up. Welcome to reality. Superpowers are superpowers. Neighbors of superpowers will always have less sovereignty. You know, it's an illusion to believe that countries can really determine their own fate if they're small and weak. Men will always be chauvinists. I mean, Trump, you know, look at what Trump said in this town hall meeting with CNN when he was asked about the sexual harassment case against him. He said, come on, you know, women have always admired powerful and rich men. Right? It's been like this for 1 million years. That's politics of eternity, right? There is no development, and just deal with it. So having said this, I think that just 4 points that where autocracy incorporated has limits. First of all, there is no such thing as nationalist internationalism. And yes, the Slovak-Hungarian example is probably the exception that confirms the rule. But I mean, you know, Polish and German nationalists in the same European political family does not work. And Ryszard Czarnecki confirmed that to me 3 days ago. Just one example, or Hungarian and Romanian nationalists in the same organization. You know, so while there are common enemies such as the globalists and international elites and so on, there are also, for countries that are close together and have difficult history, a difficult historical background, it is pretty hard for nationalists to consistently work together. I think oppression is actually a one-way street because it tends to radicalize itself, and there's no easy way back. You cannot, you know, if Orbán today tried to take a step back and kind of seriously liberalize Hungary, he would endanger his own rule immediately. There is this classical weakness of autocracies, and that's the question of succession. They, you know, when the dictator dies or is incapacitated, you know, what happens then? And that's always when all bets are off. And, you know, look at the Prigozhin story where for one day it seemed like Russia was experiencing a military coup or something. And then, of course, there is long-term output legitimacy, which also Ms. Jaurová quoted before. You have to deliver, and Jacek also mentioned this element of, you know, if liberal Democrats want to win, they have to deliver better than autocrats do. And the last point, Democrats of the world unite. And here I just want to mention a couple of memes. One, of course, quoting Churchill in his famous speech, "We shall never surrender." You know, we shall fight them on the beaches, we shall fight them in the towns, we shall never surrender. And even if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it were subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle. I mean, so, you know, even if Trump wins, there are still Democrats across the world that can unite. Now, how? Civil society is key. We've heard this from both speakers before. Civil society organizations have to gang up and cooperate and exchange best practice and help each other. Things like the Summit of Democracies that Biden inspired will also be helpful. And finally, the narratives that should be used by liberal Democrats: corruption, extremely important point. Output legitimacy, I already said, and be careful on the wokeness factor, and critically self-examine whether liberalism is still truly liberal or hasn't sometimes derailed. So in conclusion, I would say 100 years ago, the world was pretty much at a similar point as we are today. Again, at that time, autocracy seemed to be the wave of the future. Democracies and capitalist free market democracies seemed like really, really old. The up and coming forces were collectivist political parties from the left and right. And just one last thought, from Caracas to Minsk to Tehran to Moscow to Yangon to Hong Kong to Beijing, it's always the best and the brightest that take tremendous risks, and they still do it, and they will in future. Tremendous risks, including their own, not only careers, but physical integrity, their lives even, for ideals that we hold dear. And as long as we don't see 100,000 smart young people demonstrating for one-party rule in European capitals, I think liberal democracy stands a fighting chance.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Roland. Again, no comments, I'm sorry, but we will have time enough in the debate to discuss these important issues. And now I will pass the floor to Zsuzsi. So are the bad guys actually going to win? Will we have an illiberal international soon?
Thank you very much, István. I will limit myself to see how they are doing within the European Union. And maybe a little bit even more narrowly, I will look at how those who follow a populist radical right ideology among the bad guys are faring. So just very basic and short, I promise, conceptual clarification who I am talking about when I'm saying populist radical right. For now, I'm focusing on parties and those who are ideologically nativist, authoritarian, and of course, since I'm saying populist radical right, are populist. And I will, as I said, will focus now on the European Union, and since we are just ahead of the European parliamentary elections, in fact, 2 months away, I will see how these parties that I consider to be part of the populist radical right today in Europe are likely going to perform. But before going that, I was thinking it might be useful to give a little bit of context to put these parties into a short historical overview. So Roland already mentioned that one of the issues with the authoritarian international, when it concerns especially the nationalists, is that it's quite hard for them to sustainably cooperate. And that has actually been the case within the European Union too, throughout the 2000s. 1990s and 2000s, there have been various initiatives of radical right nationalist parties trying to come together into a political group. Well, they didn't exactly survive any political cycle. But this has started to actually change over the past decade. In 2015, after the elections, the first purely radical right political group was formed, at that point led by Marine Le Pen, which actually survived the entire political cycle after its formation. This was ENF, the European National Europe for Nation and Freedom. And the core group of this political group went on to establish identity and democracy in the current European Parliament. Now, why is that? What happened that actually helped this political group to survive? Whereas, indeed, in the 2000s, the animosity between the nationalists who were trying to form such political groups essentially prevented these groups to succeed. From 1516 on, we actually do see a uniting theme that these parties could subscribe to. And in that period, primarily, it was migration. So again, what unites them? The enemy pictures, who they are jointly fighting. And with the refugee and migration crisis, history delivered a jointly acceptable enemy for these parties. In addition to that, there is a strong Euroscepticism which bring them together. And this was enough of a basis for the political group to survive. And now I was only talking about ENF and ID. But let me also take one more step. We also have seen in this period the transformation of another political group that has radical right party members, namely the ECR, especially after the departure of the Tories with Brexit. ECR also, with this departure, started to become ideologically more homogeneous than it was, although it was still not enough, and I believe it's still not enough today, to bring together the two radical right political groups, ID and ECR, in the near future. But we nonetheless see this transformation. And along the way, with the political groups surviving, there is also a certain level of professionalization of the radical right on the European scene. What we see is that with time, and especially after Brexit, these parties are no longer just purely anti-EU. Their agenda is not driven by their country, wanting their country to exit the European Union, but they have been adjusting. They are still Eurosceptic, but now they are arguing that they want to reform the European Union from within. And how so? By bringing back what Roland mentioned, the strong nation state, defending national sovereignty, which incidentally goes against the current idea enshrined in the treaties that talks about ever closer union that would necessitate, in fact, some form of deepening of the cooperation. These radical right parties, still talking about the European level, they are also having now the ambition to shape the policy agenda and not just obstruct. They are trying to directly influence legislation, but they also exert an indirect influence on the mainstream right. And what we have seen, especially in this last ongoing, outgoing political cycle, is that on certain topics which are at the core of the radical rights agenda, for example, migration, there has been a shift also in the mainstream right towards the agenda of the radical right. So these parties are gaining a level of influence. Can I please get the pointer?
Sure, of course.
Thank you. So this is just to set the scene where we are on the European level. Where we are in numerical terms. I thought that I bring you a relatively recent info sheet from the European Council on Foreign Relations. Of course, this is simply just the current distribution of seats in the European Parliament. You see that the mainstream has a majority, but there are two sizable radical right groups, ECR and Identity and Democracy. But against the background that I have just discussed, we are approaching a European parliamentary election that will likely bring the rise of ID and ECR, and coincidentally, the decrease of MEPs in EPP, Renew, the Greens, and SND. Why is that? Well, of course, we also need to look beyond the European level, at the national level. We do see that radical right parties are increasingly successful on the national scene. They are, in several cases, also present in national governments, and for the first time are senior partners in national governments outside of Central and Eastern Europe. In Central and Eastern Europe, of course, we had radical right parties leading governments, think of Fidesz, for example, but now we also have one in Italy. So we are observing a shift. Beyond that, of course, we see parties of radical right orientation rising, East and West. In the West, think of the rise of Rassemblement National, or the new cases of Chega and Vox in the Iberian Peninsula, which for a long time was the region in Europe that actually did not have strong radical right parties. We see these parties rising in the Nordic countries. Think of the last Dutch elections. So there is increasing support behind these parties. I will not go into the reasons why that is on the national level. We can also touch on that in the discussion. But there are some joint themes there that fuel their support. So how would the next European Parliament look like? Will there be a radical right, right-wing liberal takeover? This is the projection of the European Council on Foreign Relations based on polling data from January and adjusted to the experience of previous European parliamentary elections, looking at how polling looked in the January before the 14 and 19 elections and how ultimately the parties fared in the EP election, just for the methodological note. The ECFR polling projects that there will be a significant rise in ECR and ID, whereas we would have a bigger non-aligned group. Still, the mainstream, SND, Greens, Renew, and EPP would have the majority. So we are not expecting here a tidal wave of the radical right taking over, but there will be a stronger ID and ECR in the next European Parliament. Why is that? If we look a little bit further, in ID, the gains are primarily due to the gains of Rassemblement National and AFD. In ECR, the gains are primarily due to the rising support behind Meloni's Fratelli d'Italia. Now, one more thing that I believe we need to factor in, you already see here that the first political group would still be EPP, second would remain SND, but the third, according to this prediction, would already be ID, taking over that place from Renew. And ECR and Renew are close fourth together. And there we have a still relatively unpredictable factor, namely Fidesz. Where will Fidesz sit in the next European Parliament? It will not alter the big picture, but I believe it's still important to consider that Fidesz potentially joining ECR would mean, and we are calculating there with roughly 12 seats, would bring up ECR to the level of ID ahead of Renew. So we would have two competing radical right political groups in the European Parliament, which will most certainly have an influence on, if not legislation, but the agenda, certainly. So what would this mean in practical terms? It does not automatically translate into policy convergence. So there will be differences between ID and ECR. So I think for the moment we can still exclude a merger. One of the biggest reasons is the political groups differing attitudes towards Russia, but that's just one of several reasons. Roland actually alluded to the animosities that still exist between radical right parties from neighboring countries often. So in ECR, one of the leading parties would be Law and Justice, whereas in ID, it's Alternative for Germany. Quite unlikely that these two parties would sit in one political group. This could, in practice, translate into some form of competition between the two to set the agenda. How else does their presence influence the future European legislative agenda? For that, we can already look at the present political cycle. Although there has been a cordon sanitaire in the European Parliament against identity and democracy, if they had initiatives, it was still either watered down or completely voted out from legislative proposals. This was already less so with ECR. And ECR is going to gain ground with AFD and Rassemblement National being the strongest members of this group. EPP, certain parts of EPP are also opening up towards cooperation. With ECR, we have heard the stories about EPP courting Meloni to win her over. This can translate into particular concrete issues. But what I think is ultimately maybe more worrying is not just the specific legislation on policy issues in the EP, but also the fact that we are seeing a rightward shift. And rightward here, I'm not meaning it in the classical left-right economic division, but here using right shorthand for what we can consider as the traditional authoritarian nationalist segment of the political spectrum. We see a shift in that direction, not just in the EP, but also the EP is just a reflection of what is happening in national politics in the European Union. On the one hand, this reflects voters' disillusionment with the mainstream. On the other hand, however, it also reflects the mainstream growing cooptation of the radical right agenda, seeing the radical right increasingly as a party group that has a blackmail potential that in certain cases, as we see as radical right parties are increasingly entering government, translates into coalition potential. So radical right parties do have an increasing influence while it's reflected already on the EP level, on the European level. The influence is more real and more worrisome, I believe, on the national level. And moving towards the what to do agenda, beyond all the things that were raised in terms of how to defend liberal democracy as democrats, citizens, civil society. One more thing that was not mentioned and I want to highlight is the role and responsibility of the mainstream. I was arguing that the shift is partly due to the mainstream co-optation. The thing is that when mainstream parties start to co-opt radical right program points, positions, there is a shift in the political life of a given country, and I believe this transfers to the European Union. And this shift does not bounce back. It means an alteration of politics, of political discourse. That is the new normal. And the mainstream, when co-opting the radical right, contributes to the legitimization. It does not actually take out the wind of the radical right sails, but makes it normalized. So my call of action here is for the mainstream to uphold the cordon sanitaire, not just in the European Parliament in the future, but also in the national arenas, because breaking down the cordon sanitaire is like opening the Pandora's box, and we have seen quite enough of what that means when we look at Central and Eastern Europe. So I would leave it here, and looking forward to your questions.
Yeah, thank you, Zsuzsi, and thank you for all your presentations. Now we will collect some questions, maybe 4 or 5 maximum. I will also have one question at the end. So who would like to start? Please put your questions in a couple of sentences, not for we don't have time for long comments and presentations. Yes, we will start back. Kester, please.
Oh, sorry, thank you. Thank you very much. Gosh, try and keep my question limited here. What do I want to say? Yes, you brought up, several of you brought up the situation of NGOs and the persecution of NGOs and the importance of NGOs in Slovakia, in Poland, in restoring some form of democracy or democratic government at various times. One of the things which has struck me, sorry, Hungarians in the room, I think there are some wonderful champions of NGOs in this country, and I think there's some, well, I think one leader should be the country's president, actually, better than recent ones. But overall, I feel there's a weakness of NGOs in Hungary. I mean, civic society, there's much more of a feeling of I'm all right, Jack, or Lotzi, and until, of course, someone comes along from the government and actually attacks you. So, very difficult question, but how can we solve this problem if it is a problem? And one other thing, our Bratislava lady mentioned, I think, or rather didn't mention, was the church's role. Now, Orbán government has bought the churches fundamentally, except perhaps some of the most Christian ones, which he persecutes. And you mentioned it, I believe, Jacek, in Poland, that they were buying, PIS was buying the churches. But where does that fit in to the NGO system? Thank you.
Thank you. Now, György Tatár.
Thank you very much. I'm from an organization which is dealing with dialogue and mass atrocities prevention. And first of all, I wanted just to congratulate you because I learned a lot from all this information. And I regret a bit that I don't see any politician here, except for Mrs. Jaurová, but from Hungary, I don't see anybody who would listen to these things. Therefore, I would like to suggest you, maybe next time we could organize something where the politicians would be hearing as well some clever and smart ideas. Sometimes I get the feeling that the politicians think that they know the way forward, so we have probably be a bit more humble. Second point is that I wanted to call your attention that in whole Europe, the population becomes older. And that's why is the reason that older people are more or less traditional people. So that's why this whole wave comes up where the so-called rightists, in the terms of Zsuzsa, the rightists come up. Therefore, we have to focus on the young people who are more inclined to us, to the reformers. They do believe much better in the future, and this is our strength. This is my second point. The third point is that I am would like to fight with not criticize you, but just to say my opinion about the fight that what you use in the title. I don't want to see any fight. I want to see countering those who are let's say so, on the other side than we are, because if we fight, then we don't see the peace in the society, and we need peace in the society. From the fight, we can have some extreme situations, but we have to prevent. And in that point comes my last remark, and probably also the question, and this is about dialogue. We speak about fight, we speak about countering, but we don't speak about how to do that. And what I have heard from you, we have to do this, we have to do that, but I have not heard that we have to listen to the other side. Because if we don't listen what the other side says, for example, in the case of migration, how long migration, our policy was pro-migration and putting aside the aspect of security. And when it started in Poland and in other countries with the security, then also the whole opinion shaped. And in this respect, I would like to oppose with Zsuzsa what you said about the cordon sanitaire, that I am very strongly against the idea. So we, even in the European Parliament, and also this is valid for the whole Europe, that we want to isolate the other side, also the so-called radicals. We want to keep them silent, but we don't want to hear what they say. And what we don't want to do is also, we should start this dialogue with some self-critics, what we have not had before. And one last, very last point is that we need to organize much more discussions, debates, where both sides, even if they are radicals, they will have their own say, because otherwise people will not have the possibility to make a comparison what we say and what they do say, what they say. Therefore, it's better that we put them together and let the population decide who has a better option. So therefore, I just wanted to, and this is also in a kind of brainstorming, so I would like to hear your views on all that. Of course, it is not the situation is not for that, but just I wanted to use this as a sort of brainstorming, and we need to organize more brainstorming where we would have the responses and questions mutually. Sorry for being a bit longer.
Thank you, Yuri. This is the debate period, so it's wonderful. Okay, I think Zsuzsa Szerényi was first, and then you. Yeah. Go ahead, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think it was super interesting for all of your contribution. I would like to come back to the Democrats Unite idea, which Roland raised a couple of minutes ago, and also linked to Kester's question a little bit of the civil society's involvement in the pro-democracy activism, because it's a bit blurry whether we speak about NGOs and organized civil society or the people who actually go to the street, and that's what we also see in Hungary oftentimes. And civil society is often mobilized by political parties, or journalists when there is a new scandal turning out. So it's not so evident, and I think we have to be, if we really want to look for what the next step to take, a bit more concrete and not just speak about civil society. So I would like to ask also both of you from Slovakia and Poland, how political parties are actually strategically allied with organized civil society and free-minded journalists who are actually the ones who are making the news. Or in Hungary, we have now, and I'm pretty sure both other countries, the media influencers who, like Partisan in Hungary, which looks like journalists, but it's actually activism. And they can mobilize a lot of people. Podcast holders who are oftentimes more influential than politicians or journalists. So these are, for me, the actors of doers, of actors of politics in these days. And so how was this in Poland, for example? Because it was not only the tactical part of the political parties, and also in Slovakia, that's a kind of conglomerate of journalists have very influential. So the other issue for Zsuzsi and Roland of what is the situation in Berlin and Brussels in this regard? How political actors, think tankers, other doers are aware of what we are talking, what from their side is cooperation, strategic cooperation, pro-democracy cooperation means. Thank you.
Thank you. Gregor Meyer.
Gregor Meyer, I'm the correspondent for the German press agency for Southeast Europe. Yes, this cordon sanitaire question, I think there are different types of cordon sanitaire. One thing is what the mainstream parties are doing in the European Parliament, as you described it, that no cooperation at all with the radical right, with the more radical right, no for their Anträge or for their whatever, no seats in commissions, and so on and so on. And the other kind of cordon sanitaire, what you mentioned, is the what you said, co-opting of policies or of, and there I'm not so sure if this is really the case, that co-opting, let's say, a policy of migration, which may be more tough than before because of the situation has changed, would help the radical right. We have seen that the AfD was rising in Germany in the polls during and after this migration wave of 2015, and the mainstream parties having not answers given for many reasons, state of law and so on, but not having answers in the eyes of the wider public to this question. So I would here differentiate between co-opting a rhetorics of the right wing and not be able to do something. This is in fact danger, but making a policy, somehow develop a policy, still in the framework of the state of law, which might be very difficult, but that's what politics should do. And what I see is that mainstream politicians in Western countries, not to speak about the Eastern, but in Western countries, are not doing politics. They are swimming with moods. They are reacting. And then when there is a policy, it's just wrong. I could bring a lot of examples also from Southeast Europe, but it's perhaps not the time frame for that.
Thank you, Gregor. Now, my question is very similar to some of yours. Going back to European level, I would be interested to have your views how much the national politicians and political parties from Slovakia, Fico, Smer, PiS from Poland, AfD, and Fidesz, how would they make politics in the next period after the European elections? We don't know the results. After the Slovak presidential elections, we hope that we will know the result today. So I mean that will the right-wing populist parties mostly follow the Orbánist way, a sort of fundamentalism, which is an alternative to the mainstream currently, what he wants to do at European and global level, what we haven't discussed so deeply actually today or yesterday. Or most of them will follow a sort of Meloni strategy to cooperate with the mainstream. And then it comes to the question whether liberals and Democrats should resist this challenge of Meloni, or should we cooperate with Meloni, maybe because of tactical reason, who would be the president of the European Commission, or maybe further on, as you mentioned, a lot of policy issues. So this is a question to all of you. Should we go to the reverse order now, maybe starting with Shushi? Okay. Yes.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the comments question regarding the cordon sanitaire. Points well taken. I think, yes, this, like what we mean by cordon sanitaire needs further elaboration. And I would start with the points that George raised. I think we need to differentiate between engaging with a certain actor and engaging with grievances and fears that those who vote for that actor are facing and trying to bring to the table. And I by no means advocate for ignoring those fears and grievances. What I'm saying is that these actors very often just ride the tide of that grievance and fear, and when they embrace certain policy issues, and then I will also go to the policy, then it does not go without often fairly authoritarian, anti-democratic positions. So if mainstream parties engage with these actors, they engage with the whole package. At the same time, they should indeed engage with the grievances, and they should address those issues that voters bring to the table and why they vote for radical right parties. And that brings me to the point about different types of cordon sanitaire and the policy and what we mean by policy. When I was talking about policy positions, I was talking about both measures and the rhetoric. And you are right, that there can be certain measures that address a certain problem, but it does matter what is the justification and what is the rhetoric, and whether it is still resting on the rule of law, whether it's still resting on certain liberal principles, international agreements, when those measures are implemented. And whether they are still, if we are talking about the issue of migration and asylum, whether they still uphold certain international norms. And I think that those have also been challenged in measures that were, for example, adopted even by the European Union and that have been endorsed by also mainstream actors. Think of the pushbacks, for example. So yes, it's definitely more complicated and there is nuance to the story. But when I was advocating for the cordon sanitaire, I by no means meant to say that just ignore the voters, just ignore the parties. Don't ignore the voters, engage with the issue, but give your own answers to that that are rooted in democratic principles that we are seeking to uphold. And don't fall for the solutions that these parties readily present, because I don't think that's the answer there. And maybe I would come back to Zsuzsa's point a bit later once the others also had a chance, because I see that we are very short on time.
You can try to complete if you want, because I don't know how much time we will have at the end, so
No, that's-
Okay, now it's okay? Okay, Roland, please.
Yeah, I think what Zsuzsa here said about the cordon sanitaire question, which is the mother of all questions, I would say, in the whole debate that we have, it's complicated. And I agree with your distinction between cooperating with organizations and parties and asking the same questions but offering different solutions. But even in that, there is a dialectics that needs to be discussed, which is complicated. So the thing is that there is no universal answer to this question of how exactly do you relate to the fears that right-wing parties base their success on. Which they sometimes create themselves, but very often the fears are there, the fears are real, and they're even justified, right? So not to completely ignore them would be a big mistake. To of course repeat the rhetoric of the right-wing parties would be another mistake, but somewhere in between there is the respective national solution fitting to a particular situation. Another word on NGOs and are the politicians listening, Zsuzsa. I think Brussels, if I answer for Brussels, politicians are still too often looking at states or supranational organizations. I mean, look at the whole counter-disinfo debate, which is something that we haven't really gotten into here. Which has become a cottage industry in the last 7-8 years. I still believe that liberal democracies should not replicate the top-down approach that autocracies use to this whole information warfare thing. We should be bottom-up. The response of a free society to the disinfo and hostile influence attempts of autocracies must be bottom up. And that means governments should fund projects and not create counter-disinfo units in their own foreign ministries or the External Action Service in the European Union. It has happened now, it has happened against the will of the appeasers, so it shouldn't be taken back, but it's not my ideal of a situation. I think the EU should fund projects rather than hire their own counter-disinfo people, right? And this is just one example. I think that the basic principle should be bottom-up as a response to the top-down approach of autocracies. Yeah, and then finally, the AfD question, what would they do if they were in power? I think in Germany, we're particularly far away from this because they really have no prospect of being in power on the national level. On the regional level, we may see some nasty surprises later this year in specific Eastern Länders, Eastern states of Germany, but it is impossible to predict. It is really impossible. The AfD has pulled off this fantastic trick of radicalizing itself and going more towards the mainstream at the same time. They have become more eligible to voters in the center, and at the same time, they are tolerating more Nazi talk in their own party, which makes it extremely hard to predict what their policies would be. But again, my prediction is they will not be in a state to seriously shape policies in the sense of developing economic development strategies or doing anything about influencing Germany's position within the European Union or stuff like that. So it's too early to tell.
Yeah. I will start with Zuza's question about relationship between NGOs and politicians. And I think that there are two things. I mean, we should respect each other's boundaries and relative spheres of autonomy. And this is something that we would ask politicians not to invade our territory, but we also shouldn't expect the politicians to replicate or one-to-one to our demands. I mean, politicians have different responsibilities, and I think that some of my colleagues within the civil society now, after the change in Poland, basically expect that, you know, they will walk into the ministry and say, like, don't do that, and the minister will, who is often our friend from an NGO, because there was a switch, will do this. So I think we need a relationship based on mutual respect and understanding and dialogue, rather than expectation that each side, and I think the same relates to the relationship between media and politicians. But I think there is another trap, and this is when NGOs fall into quite often, is trying to keep the same distance to democratic and non-democratic politicians. And this is also in response to your questions, whether we should invite people from parties which are non-democratic, populist or authoritarian to our debates and debate with them. Quite a long time ago, and I run a think tank, so it's not a typical NGO, but it's still an NGO, I decided it's useless. I mean, we tried for the first year when Law and Justice was in power, I tried to invite people from that party, especially not the top politicians, but like administrators, to our debates. It didn't serve any useful purpose. To be honest, they are very well trained in muddling the debate, muddling the water, creating a fight. And so we basically focus on that. That's why I showed you the picture of these 4 politicians holding the reports. We focus on trying to enable debate between Democrats who were divided. There was an asymmetry, very clear asymmetry. On one hand, you had united right, the government, and then divided opposition. So we tried to enhance debate within the opposition. That was I try to keep the distance to politics, but at the same time make very strong distinction between democratic and non-democratic politicians. And I actually believe in the cordon sanitaire, that you know, you should understand who your friends and who your enemies are within the political sphere if you want to be politically engaged. I mean, engaged as a citizen or civic organization. Yeah, maybe I'll stop here.
Zora, please.
I maybe briefly tackle the issue of church, which I find very interesting as a granddaughter of a pastor and wife of a former pastor, and as somebody who has 4 semesters of theology. It's a question I find extremely significant for at least Poland and Slovakia, but maybe also overall Central Europe. And I really like the way you put the question in connection with the civil society. And the simple answer to that is that the church, predominantly Catholic Church in our 2 countries, is not the civil society. And that's very interesting, because the story is that the church, which was the main force against communism, the main heroic dissident source fighting with the communism, has become very early after the change a non-democratic institution which instinctively and inevitably collaborates with the authoritarian tendencies in those countries. It's a sad story to me. And in Slovakia specifically, it is not the civil society, even because it was never separated from the state. We still fund the church, the state funds the church, while the separation of state and church was one of the demands of the revolution in '89, and it's the only one which haven't been fulfilled. because now for them, like we have the system of funding the church, which was inherited from the communism, and it was created by the communist government to control the church, because they've been paying for the pastors' salaries and everything. It was for the controlling the church. Now the church really likes it. And our new government is going, they even have it in their governmental declaration. It's very hard to translate that formulation, but it basically says, if the church will do what we want, we will bribe them with more money. I mean, this is the vulgar interpretation, but the formulation is very funny. So, yes, it's complicated with the relationship of the church towards the protecting of the democracy. And I think Slovakia, in this respect, is even like more medieval than Poland. Funny to say that, because the Slovak Catholic Church never ever had any opposition even within the church. Like in Poland, you find the intellectual in the Catholic Church, you find there is a debate within the Catholic Church about the political issue, about the issues of democracy. That never happened in Slovakia, never ever. There are actually no intellectual elites in the Catholic Church. And the most shining example of that is that there was the Archbishop of Slovakia a couple of years ago, who was maybe, I mean, it's really funny because I know him very well and he's a very traditional person, but on the medieval standards of Slovak Catholic Church, he was a little bit more progressive than those Inquisition guys they have there. So actually, there was a kind of intrigue campaign in the Catholic Church, and the Pope Benedict put him down. And there was a big division in the Catholic Church because he had a lot of supporters within the church. So yeah, it's difficult to deal with the church. And our recipe, you know, I am a member of this progressive liberal party. I think we have more priests and pastors and theologians in our party than any other party in Slovakia. And to me, this is also the issue how to deal with the concepts of faith in the society, and how to deal with the concept of Christian faith, actually, which we have to deal with, is to integrate the progressive part of it also in the political discourse, because if these voices are not heard in the society, then it will be always the medieval structure which prevails. And then maybe just one sentence to this eternal question of cordon sanitaire and of whether, I think, to me, this is the crucial question of the politics. And for me, entering the politics, this was always the most difficult dilemma. And it is whether the ends justify the means. And it seems like the answer is easy, but it's very difficult, because especially in the situation when you can prevent, you know, the autocrat raising to the power, can you use the means of the other side? And that's very tempting in political marketing. And that's maybe partial answer to your question, because my experience, my practical experience is that, yeah, I understand what you say when you say we have to listen to those people, but my experience is that listening to extremists when you are a politician very often leads to becoming one. That's the case of Robert Fico, for example, for sure, because it's so tempting. And if it comes to listening to grievances and fears of the voters, I think even that is a little bit tricky, because most of the fears we are talking about are induced by these populists. They are not real. It's, you know, like bears in Slovakia. Come on, I mean, that's a very good example, but migrants, you know, all these fears are made up. It's because it's easy political marketing to operate with fear. And then the question, of course, is, what is the real fear? What is the real political issue? And I think that works also in politics, but also in psychology, that if you have this really big fear somewhere, something you cannot deal with, then you have to create these proxy fears, because then you are fiddling with those and you forget the big question. And to me, the big fear and the big question is that the concept of future has fallen apart. That, you know, when I grew up, even if it was in communist Czechoslovakia, my parents were telling me that if I do everything right, and if I will learn a lot, and if I will be a good person, I will have a better life than they have. But now, when I look on my son, I catch myself thinking, I hope he's not much worse than I was in his age, because the concept of better future is not there anymore. And of course, it is $1 million question how to, and now I speak as a politician, how to provide to people the good concept, the good prospect of the future in the times they are totally uncertain and unpredictable. And of course, I mean, who solves it, then he is the winner of the politics in next coming years. But I think this is the crucial question we have to talk about, and there is no other chance how to fight with this inducement of fear than to provide a positive alternative. And I strongly believe the end doesn't justify the means in politics, and I've seen it many times, and it's almost a metaphysical belief of mine.
Thank you. I just want to ask our panelists whether you want to react to each other or you want to make anything as a sort of final words or conclusion, or are you satisfied with the current state of affairs?
We
Okay.
are not satisfied.
You are not so satisfied. You never told us what would be the outcome of the Slovak
presidential
election.
elections. You know, it's interesting because it illustrates a lot what we have said today, that we have the second round of presidential elections, and the two competitors are basically, one is the Speaker of the Parliament, the guy who created that party which separated from Robert Fico because he wanted to show the better, nicer European face of that party. Now he is with him in the government, and he runs for president. And he pretends he is new, free politician who has nothing to do with Fico. The other one now he is already an opposition candidate, but he didn't run as an opposition candidate. He's how do you call it, a civil candidate, but he is the former Minister of Foreign Affairs from the previous government, but value-wise, he is the pro-European, pro-liberal candidate. And the polls are saying that it's precisely 50-50. So basically what can happen is that there will be, like, it's really valid that each vote counts. So it's totally unpredictable. A lot of thrill tonight. And we have to run back home to vote because our votes count.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Zora. I just would like to say couple of words to conclude. First of all, I would like to thank all of you who were listening to us in person or on Zoom. I think yesterday we successfully mapped the problems of Hungary, talking about economics and foreign policy and cultural issues like gender. And today we focus more on the global picture, especially on the European elections. So I think in that sense we covered most of our topics we wanted to discuss. However, I somehow at the end feel that we missed some issues, especially the conflict, the war against Ukraine. We haven't discussed it so deeply, or the forthcoming US elections and what would be the impact of a comeback of Trump. But we did not have time for everything. What I did not miss so much, that we haven't talked in long presentations about Orbán, what we used to do a couple of years ago, and maybe it shows that it's not so bad, that he is certainly a very important public and political figure in the international arena as well, but he is just a troublemaker at the moment and not such a strong influencer as we maybe believed a couple of years ago. We will see how it happens. We discussed at the end what might be the future of a populist international or illiberal international. So it comes together with the very Hungarian story and Orbánism. And what you mentioned, and maybe a global playbook, what populists and illiberals now share, actually not only in Europe. When I was at a conference with the Naumann Foundation a couple of months ago in Germany, it turned out that there is a playbook which is actually more universal than simply the Hungarian laboratory, what Orbán talked about a couple of years ago, that when I talked about Hungary, the guy from Pakistan or Mexico came to me saying it's exactly the same story what we face today at home. So I think that liberals and Democrats should unite themselves. And just one word about the title of our conference. It's complicated, using your argument, because it's a common project of 3 NGOs. It's a coalition of Hungarian NGOs, and the title was not given by myself, but we accepted it. But I understand Judy's point that maybe it's not the best expression. So, okay, but you're certainly right. And again, I would like to thank you to the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom for its sponsorship. And I would like to thank you to our partners, even if we have a discussion about the title of the conference. But I think talking about the real content of our conference, we had friends here. And that's another point what you haven't mentioned. When we invite people to discuss issues, certainly we haven't invited anyone from the Hungarian government, because it has no sense anymore. From my perspective. On the other hand, they would not come. So that's another reason why you cannot meet today the representatives of the Hungarian government. I hope that in spite of that, you enjoyed this event, and I hope that we will continue our cooperation with our sponsor, with our friends, with our network, and with all of you as an audience and participants next time again. So thank you for coming, and see you all soon. Here or there, maybe in Bratislava, in Brussels, or in Warsaw soon. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.